When Sarah Mitchell signed up for what she thought was a routine wilderness survival course, she never imagined she'd become the center of the largest search and rescue operation in Colorado's history. What started as a simple weekend camping trip would transform into a test of human endurance that would push her beyond every limit she thought she had. The mountains don't care about your plans. They don't care about your experience, your equipment, or your confidence. When nature decides to remind you who's really in charge, it does so with brutal efficiency. Sarah was about to learn this lesson in the most terrifying way possible. This isn't just another survival story. This is the account of how one woman's fight for survival in the unforgiving wilderness became a beacon of hope that brought together strangers, tested the limits of military precision, and proved that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary things. The rescue that followed would involve elite Army Rangers, cutting-edge technology, and a race against time that had an entire nation holding its breath. But before the helicopters, before the media attention, before she became a symbol of human resilience, Sarah was just a 29-year-old accountant from Denver who thought she knew what she was getting herself into. She was wrong. And that mistake would change everything. Sarah Mitchell had always been the kind of person who researched everything to death. When she decided to take a wilderness survival course, she spent 3 weeks reading every blog post, watching every YouTube video, and studying every gear list she could find. Her apartment became a temporary outdoor store, filled with sleeping bags, water purification tablets, emergency blankets, and enough freeze-dried meals to feed a small expedition. Her friends thought she was crazy. "You work with spreadsheets all day, Sarah," her roommate Jessica had said, watching Sarah practice tying knots in their living room. "Why do you want to go sleep on rocks and eat bugs in the mountains?" But Sarah had her reasons. At 29, she felt like her life had become too predictable, too safe. She woke up, went to her accounting job, came home, watched Netflix, and repeated the cycle. The wilderness course seemed like the perfect way to break out of her comfort zone and prove to herself that she was capable of more than balancing books and analyzing spreadsheets. The course was run by mountain survival experts, a company with an excellent reputation and experienced guides. The website promised a life-changing experience that would teach participants essential wilderness skills while pushing them to discover their inner strength. Sarah had signed up for the advanced 3-day program, despite having never spent a night camping in her life. When she arrived at the base camp in the Colorado Rockies on a crisp Friday morning in late September, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of the first day of school. The mountains loomed around them, their peaks dusted with early snow that gleamed white against the deep blue sky. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. There were 8 participants in total, ranging in age from 22 to 45. There was Marcus, a software developer from Austin who looked like he lived at the gym. Jennifer, a nurse from Phoenix who had completed 2 marathons. David and Rebecca, a married couple from Seattle who did triathlons together. Kyle, a college student studying environmental science. Maria, a chef from Santa Fe who wanted to learn about foraging. And Tom, a recently retired police officer from Chicago. Their instructor was Jake Morrison, a weathered man in his early 40s who moved through the wilderness with the fluid grace of someone who had spent more time in the mountains than in civilization. He had served as an Army Ranger before becoming a survival instructor, and his calm confidence immediately put the group at ease. "The mountains will teach you more about yourself than any classroom ever could," Jake told them during the opening briefing. "But they're not forgiving teachers. Every decision you make out here matters. Every mistake has consequences. My job is to keep you safe while you learn those lessons." The first day was spent learning basic skills at the base camp. They practiced building shelters using natural materials, learned how to purify water from streams, and discovered which plants were edible and which could kill them. Sarah threw herself into every lesson with characteristic intensity, filling a notebook with detailed observations and diagrams. Jake noticed her dedication. "You're a thorough student, Sarah," he said during a break. "But remember, knowledge is only half the battle out here. The other half is trusting your instincts and staying calm when things don't go according to plan." Sarah nodded, but privately she thought that thorough preparation would prevent most problems before they started. She had contingency plans for her contingency plans, and she felt confident that her methodical approach would serve her well in the wilderness. The second day brought their first real challenge. Jake led them on a 6-mile hike to a remote area where they would spend the night using only the skills they had learned. The trail was steep and rocky, winding through dense forests of aspen and pine before emerging above the tree line onto windswept ridges. Sarah struggled more than she had expected. Despite her research and preparation, nothing had really prepared her for the physical demands of hiking at altitude while carrying a heavy pack. Her legs burned, her lungs fought for air, and her shoulders ached from the weight of her carefully selected gear. But she pushed through, determined not to be the one holding back the group. When they finally reached their destination, a small clearing near a mountain lake, Sarah felt a surge of pride that was unlike anything she had experienced in her comfortable office job. The evening was magical. They built a fire using primitive techniques, cooked simple meals over the flames, and shared stories under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any Sarah had ever seen. The city girl, who had never spent a night away from electric lights, found herself mesmerized by the vast darkness punctuated by countless points of light. "This is why I do this," Jake said, settling beside the fire with a cup of hot tea made from pine needles. "Out here, all the noise of modern life falls away. You remember what's really important." Sarah understood what he meant. For the first time in years, she felt truly present, fully engaged with the world around her, instead of lost in the endless cycle of emails, deadlines, and obligations that normally consumed her thoughts. Then, the third day started before dawn. Jake woke them while the stars were still visible, explaining that they would be attempting a more challenging exercise. "Today, you'll each spend 4 hours alone in the wilderness with minimal gear," he announced. "This is about building confidence in your individual abilities and learning to trust yourself." The group would be split up and positioned at different locations within a 2-mile radius. Each person would receive basic supplies and a simple task: build a shelter, find and purify water, and signal for pickup at the designated time. Jake would monitor everyone remotely and provide assistance only in genuine emergencies. Sarah felt her stomach flutter with anxiety but also excitement. This was what she had been preparing for, the real test of everything she had learned. She was assigned to a location on a rocky ledge about a mile from the main camp, accessible by a narrow trail that wound through thick forest before emerging onto an exposed ridge. Jake walked her to the location personally, pointing out landmarks and escape routes. "Your pickup point is right here," he said, indicating a small clearing on the ledge. "I'll be back at exactly 2 p.m. If you need help before then, use this." He handed her an emergency whistle and a small mirror for signaling. "But I don't expect you'll need them. You're ready for this, Sarah." Alone for the first time since arriving in the mountains, Sarah felt the weight of solitude settle around her like a thick blanket. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. She set to work immediately, her methodical nature taking over. First, she explored her assigned area, noting sources of water, wind patterns, and potential shelter sites. There was a small stream about 50 yards down the slope, and several fallen logs that would provide good building material for a lean-to shelter. The morning passed quickly as she worked. Building the shelter was harder than it had looked during the demonstrations, and she found herself growing frustrated when branches wouldn't stay in place, or when her carefully planned design proved unstable. But gradually, through trial and error, she created a basic but functional structure that would provide protection from wind and rain. Water purification was next, and she carefully collected clear stream water in her metal cup, adding purification tablets and waiting the required time before drinking. The taste was metallic and unpleasant, but she felt proud of producing safe drinking water from a natural source. By noon, she had completed her assigned tasks and was feeling confident about the exercise. She even had time to practice some of the knot-tying techniques Jake had shown them, and to experiment with different methods of fire building using only natural materials. That's when she heard the helicopter. At first, she thought it might be part of the exercise, perhaps Jake using dramatic flair to make the pickup more interesting. But as the sound grew closer, she realized it was flying low and fast, following the valley below her position. She could see it now. A small red and white aircraft that looked like a medical helicopter rather than a tourist or training flight. The helicopter passed directly below her ledge, close enough that she could see the pilot clearly. It was moving with obvious urgency, heading toward the main camp area, where Jake and the other participants were located. Sarah felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Something was wrong. She checked her watch. It was 12:45 p.m., still more than an hour before her scheduled pickup. Jake had been very clear about the timing, emphasizing that part of the exercise was learning to manage time and be ready when help arrived. But the helicopter's presence suggested that the exercise might be over early, possibly due to an emergency. Sarah gathered her gear and hiked to the pickup point, arriving 15 minutes early. She positioned herself in clear view and waited, listening for sounds of Jake's approach through the forest. Minutes passed. The helicopter had disappeared over a ridge, its sound fading into silence. The mountains returned to their profound quiet, with only the wind in the trees and the distant trickle of the stream below. At 2 p.m. exactly, Sarah was ready and waiting. Jake was always punctual, and she expected to see him emerge from the forest trail at any moment. But 2 p.m. came and went without any sign of him. She wasn't immediately worried. Perhaps the helicopter had caused some delay, or maybe he was having difficulty with one of the other participants who might be struggling with their assigned tasks. By 2:30 p.m., Sarah's confidence began to waver. Jake had stressed the importance of precise timing, and being 30 minutes late was completely out of character for him. She tried using the emergency whistle, sending 3 sharp blasts echoing across the mountainside as they had been taught. She waited, listening intently for a response, but heard only the mocking echo of her own signal bouncing off distant rock faces. At 3 p.m., Sarah had to acknowledge that something was seriously wrong. She had been abandoned on the ledge, but she couldn't understand why. Had there been an accident? Had Jake forgotten about her location? Was this some kind of extreme version of the survival exercise, designed to test how she would handle being truly alone? The rational part of her mind, the part that created detailed spreadsheets and analyzed problems methodically, told her to stay calm and think through her options. She had emergency supplies, she knew her location, and she had demonstrated that she could build shelter and find water. If this was an extended version of the exercise, she could handle it. But another part of her, a deeper instinct that city living had never fully suppressed, was beginning to whisper warnings. The mountains were vast and unforgiving. Weather could change rapidly at this altitude. She was alone, with limited supplies, and no one except Jake knew exactly where she was. As the afternoon wore on and shadows began to lengthen across the ridge, Sarah faced a decision that would determine everything that followed. She could stay at the pickup point and continue waiting, trusting that Jake would eventually come for her, or she could leave the designated area and try to find her way back to the main camp, risking getting lost in terrain she didn't know well. The mountains watched silently as she weighed her options, indifferent to her growing fear. Soon, she would learn that her choice wouldn't matter. Events far beyond her control had already set in motion the chain of circumstances that would transform her simple survival exercise into a desperate fight for life itself. But for now, as the Colorado sun began its descent toward the western peaks and the temperature started to drop, Sarah Mitchell sat alone on a narrow ledge thousands of feet above the nearest road, still believing that her careful preparation and methodical approach would be enough to see her through whatever challenge the wilderness might present. She was about to discover just how wrong she could be. By 4 p.m., Sarah's methodical mind had shifted into crisis management mode. She spread her emergency whistle signals to every 30 minutes, creating a systematic pattern that any rescuer would recognize as deliberate rather than random distress calls. Between signals, she worked on improving her shelter and gathering additional firewood, keeping busy to prevent panic from taking hold. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountainside, and Sarah could feel the temperature beginning to drop as evening approached. At this altitude, she knew from her research that temperatures could plummet dramatically after sunset. Even during the day, the thermometer might read comfortable numbers. As she worked, Sarah's mind raced through possible explanations for Jake's absence. The most logical scenario was that one of the other participants had experienced a medical emergency requiring all of Jake's attention and possibly evacuation by helicopter. That would explain the aircraft she had seen earlier. In such a situation, Jake might have been forced to delay or postpone the individual pickups while dealing with the crisis. But even as she tried to rationalize the situation, doubt gnawed at her. Jake had emphasized repeatedly that safety was his top priority, and abandoning anyone alone in the wilderness went against every principle he had taught them. He had backup plans for backup plans, communication procedures, and strict protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. As the sun sank lower toward the western peaks, Sarah made a decision that reflected both her practical nature and her growing concern. She would spend the night at the pickup point, giving Jake every opportunity to reach her, but she would prepare for the possibility that she might need to find her own way out the next morning. Her shelter, which had seemed adequate during the afternoon warmth, now looked pitifully small against the vast indifference of the mountains. Using techniques Jake had taught them, Sarah reinforced the structure with additional branches and pine boughs, creating better insulation and wind protection. She gathered enough firewood to last through the night, arranging it carefully within easy reach of her shelter. Water was her next concern. The stream below provided a reliable source, but it required a treacherous climb down a steep slope in gathering darkness. Sarah made 3 trips before sunset, filling every container she had and treating the water with purification tablets. Each trip down the rocky slope and back up to the ledge left her more exhausted, but she knew that dehydration could become deadly within days. As darkness settled over the mountains, Sarah built her first solo campfire using the primitive techniques Jake had demonstrated. The process took far longer than she had expected, and by the time flames finally caught and held, her hands were raw from friction burns, and her patience was nearly exhausted. But the sight of firelight dancing off the surrounding trees brought a comfort that went deeper than mere warmth. The night sounds of the wilderness were unlike anything Sarah had experienced in the city. During the group camping experience, conversation and Jake's reassuring presence had masked the profound isolation of the mountains. Now, alone with only her fire for company, she became acutely aware of every sound: the hoot of an owl somewhere in the darkness, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine needles, and occasionally more disturbing sounds that she couldn't identify. Sarah had read about the psychological challenges of wilderness survival, but intellectual knowledge proved inadequate preparation for the reality. As the night deepened, her imagination began transforming ordinary sounds into potential threats. Every crack of a branch became a large predator approaching her campsite. Every distant call could be something dangerous communicating with its pack. She tried to maintain her systematic approach, checking her watch regularly and adding wood to the fire at precise intervals. But time seemed to move differently in the wilderness darkness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and she found herself checking her watch obsessively, unable to believe how slowly the night was passing. Around midnight, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her firelight, she heard what sounded unmistakably like human voices. They were distant and distorted by the mountain acoustics, but they seemed to be calling out in patterns that suggested a search operation. Her heart leaped with hope and relief. Jake had finally organized a rescue party to find her. She immediately began signaling with her emergency whistle, sending the 3-blast pattern she had been taught. She added wood to her fire, creating a larger blaze that would be visible from a distance, and used her emergency mirror to reflect the firelight, sending flashing signals in all directions. But the voices, if they had been voices at all, didn't come closer. Sarah continued signaling for over an hour, shouting herself hoarse and maintaining a blazing fire that consumed most of her carefully gathered wood supply. Eventually, she was forced to acknowledge that either the voices had been her imagination, distorted by exhaustion and stress, or the search party had moved on to other areas. The realization that she might have missed her chance at rescue was devastating. Sarah found herself fighting back tears for the first time since the ordeal began. All her preparation, all her research and planning had not equipped her for the psychological toll of extended isolation in an environment where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. But Sarah had not survived 29 years and built a successful career by giving up when things got difficult. She forced herself to think rationally about her situation. Even if she had missed a search party, they knew generally where she was supposed to be. Jake had walked her to this location personally and knew her pickup point. Any rescue operation would eventually focus on this area. The logical thing to do was to make her location as visible as possible during daylight hours, and conserve her energy for signaling when rescuers were most likely to be searching. She rebuilt her fire to a sustainable level, wrapped herself in her emergency blanket and sleeping bag, and settled in to wait for dawn. Sleep came in brief, fitful intervals. Every sound jerked her back to alertness, and the cold seeped through her gear despite her careful preparation. By the time pale light began filtering through the trees, Sarah felt like she had been awake for days rather than hours. The second morning brought both hope and growing concern. Sarah's systematic mind recognized that she now faced a decision point. She had been missing for approximately 18 hours. In normal circumstances, a search and rescue operation should already be underway. The fact that she hadn't seen any clear signs of organized searching suggested that either her situation was more complicated than she had realized, or that something had happened to prevent Jake from reporting her location. Sarah spent the early morning hours improving her signaling capabilities. She arranged rocks in a large X pattern that would be visible from aircraft, cleared brush from around her fire site to make smoke more visible, and positioned her emergency mirror where it could catch and reflect sunlight throughout the day. At precisely 9 a.m., she began a new signaling schedule, using her whistle every 15 minutes and maintaining a smoky fire that sent a visible column into the clear mountain air. Between signals, she rationed her food and water carefully, trying to calculate how long her supplies might last if rescue was delayed. The morning passed without any sign of search activity. No helicopters appeared in the crystal-clear sky. No voices echoed from the surrounding forest. The mountains maintained their vast, indifferent silence, broken only by natural sounds and Sarah's regular signaling attempts. By noon, Sarah had to face a possibility that terrified her. She might be truly on her own. Whatever had happened to Jake and the rest of the group, it was clear that no immediate rescue was coming. She needed to make a choice between continuing to wait at the pickup point or attempting to find her own way back to civilization. The hiking trail that had brought her to this location was clearly marked, and she felt confident she could follow it back to the main camp. From there, she could either find the rest of her group or continue down to the trailhead and the parking area where their vehicles were waiting. The total distance was probably less than 8 miles, well within her physical capabilities under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Sarah was alone, carrying limited supplies and hiking in terrain where a single mistake could result in a fall, injury, or getting lost in wilderness that stretched for hundreds of square miles in every direction. Jake had emphasized repeatedly that staying put was usually the safest strategy when lost or separated from a group, yet staying put assumed that someone knew where to look for her and was actively searching. As the second day wore on, with no signs of rescue activity, that assumption seemed increasingly questionable. The afternoon brought an unexpected complication that would make her decision for her. Around 2 p.m., Sarah noticed clouds beginning to build on the western horizon. They were still distant, but they had the dark, towering appearance that she had learned to recognize as potentially dangerous weather systems. During their training, Jake had spent considerable time discussing mountain weather patterns and the speed with which conditions could deteriorate. "Weather in the mountains isn't like weather in the city," he had explained. "Systems can move in fast and hit hard. You need to be prepared for conditions to change completely within hours." Sarah checked her gear and supplies, running through mental calculations of what she would need to survive if the approaching weather system brought rain, wind, or even early snow to her exposed ledge position. Her shelter was adequate for fair weather, but a serious storm would test its limits. Her food supplies were already running low, and she had only enough purification tablets to treat water for a few more days. As the afternoon progressed, the approaching clouds grew larger and darker, and Sarah could feel changes in air pressure that suggested a significant weather system moving in. The wind began to pick up, causing her carefully maintained fire to smoke and sputter despite her efforts to protect it. By 4 p.m., Sarah could no longer ignore the evidence of her eyes and her growing weather sense. A major storm was approaching, and she was positioned on an exposed ridge with minimal shelter and dwindling supplies. The pickup point that had seemed like salvation 24 hours earlier was becoming a trap that could prove fatal if she remained there much longer. The decision she had been avoiding all day was made for her by the simple physics of mountain weather patterns and the approaching darkness. She would have to leave the pickup point and attempt to reach safety on her own. As Sarah began gathering her gear and preparing for what would be the most dangerous journey of her life, she had no way of knowing that her situation was about to become infinitely more complicated. The weather system approaching from the west was larger and more severe than anything the region had seen in years. Within hours, it would transform the familiar hiking trails into a maze of danger that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. But perhaps most importantly, she couldn't know that her disappearance had already triggered the largest search and rescue operation in Colorado history. Even as she prepared to abandon her position, teams of elite military personnel were being mobilized to find her, bringing with them resources and expertise that would turn her survival story into something far more dramatic than either she or her rescuers could imagine. The race against time was about to begin, and Sarah Mitchell, the methodical accountant who had simply wanted to prove herself capable of more than spreadsheets and office work, was about to become the focal point of an operation that would test the limits of human skill, technology, and determination. Sarah's decision to leave the pickup point came just as the first drops of rain began to fall, carried on gusts of wind that made her fire dance and smoke unpredictably. She had perhaps 2 hours of daylight remaining, and the approaching storm clouds promised that even those hours would be darker than normal. Packing her gear with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else, Sarah double-checked each item against the mental inventory she had maintained since the exercise began. Water purification tablets, emergency blanket, first aid supplies, the small amount of food she had left, fire-starting materials, her emergency whistle and signal mirror. Everything fit into her day pack. But the weight seemed heavier now than it had when the trip started, probably due to fatigue and stress rather than any actual increase in mass. Before leaving her temporary home on the ledge, Sarah took one final action that reflected both her practical nature and her growing understanding of wilderness survival. Using rocks and broken branches, she constructed an arrow pointing in the direction she planned to travel, along with her initials and the current date scratched into a piece of bark. If search teams did eventually reach this location, they would know which way she had gone. The hiking trail that had brought her to the ledge was clearly marked and well-maintained, but it looked different now than it had during Jake's guided tour 2 days earlier. What had seemed like a pleasant forest path now appeared fraught with potential dangers. Every route could cause a twisted ankle, every loose rock could lead to a fall, and every bend in the trail could hide obstacles that might prove impassable for a solo hiker. Sarah forced herself to move slowly and carefully, fighting the urge to hurry as the weather deteriorated around her. She had read enough survival accounts to know that most wilderness accidents resulted from people making poor decisions when rushed or panicked. Better to move deliberately and reach safety late than to rush and not reach safety at all. The trail wound through dense forest for the first mile, and Sarah found the enclosed feeling of the trees both comforting and claustrophobic. On one hand, the canopy provided some protection from the increasing rain and wind. On the other hand, the thick vegetation limited her visibility and made her feel cut off from the broader landscape that might give clues about weather patterns or potential alternate routes. As she hiked, Sarah tried to maintain the mental discipline that had served her well in her professional life. She focused on immediate concrete tasks, placing each foot securely before taking the next step, maintaining her balance on increasingly slippery rocks and roots, checking her map and compass regularly to ensure she stayed on the correct trail. But the physical demands of hiking alone in deteriorating conditions were unlike anything she had experienced. Despite all her research and preparation, nothing had truly prepared her for the way fear and exhaustion would compound each other, making every decision more difficult and every obstacle seem larger than it really was. The rain intensified as Sarah made her way through the forest, changing from scattered drops to steady precipitation that found its way through the tree canopy and began soaking through her carefully selected outdoor clothing. She had researched extensively and invested in quality rain gear, but she was discovering the difference between staying dry during a brief shower and maintaining core body temperature during extended exposure to cold mountain rain. After 2 hours of steady hiking, Sarah reached a point where the trail emerged from the dense forest onto a series of open ridges. Under normal circumstances, this section would have offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains and valleys. Now, it presented a new set of challenges that made her question whether leaving the pickup point had been the right decision. The wind on the exposed ridges was fierce, driving rain horizontally and making it difficult to maintain balance while carrying a pack. The trail, which had been clearly marked in the forest, became harder to follow as it crossed bare rock surfaces, where wind and rain had washed away the subtle signs that marked the proper route. Sarah found herself stopping frequently to check her map and compass, trying to correlate her position with the topographic features she could see through the rain and mist. What had seemed like a straightforward navigation exercise during Jake's training sessions became a complex puzzle when attempted alone in poor visibility with cold, wet hands that made handling equipment difficult. The temperature was dropping steadily as evening approached, and Sarah could feel her body beginning to lose heat faster than she could generate it through hiking. Her research had taught her to recognize the early stages of hypothermia: uncontrollable shivering, difficulty with fine motor skills, impaired judgment, and growing fatigue that seemed disproportionate to the physical exertion involved. As darkness began to fall, Sarah faced another decision point that would determine her chances of survival. She could continue hiking by flashlight, hoping to reach the main camp, or at least find better shelter before the storm worsened. Or she could stop where she was and attempt to build an emergency shelter for the night, conserving energy and avoiding the increased risks of night hiking in poor conditions. The rational part of her mind, the part that had built her successful career through careful analysis and risk management, told her that stopping was the safer choice. Night hiking in rain and wind, on unfamiliar trails, with limited visibility was exactly the kind of scenario that led to accidents and fatalities in wilderness situations. But another part of her, driven by growing desperation and fear, argued for continuing. Every hour spent in the mountains increased her exposure to the elements and reduced her remaining supplies. The longer she remained in the wilderness, the greater the chance that she would make a fatal mistake or encounter a situation beyond her ability to handle. Sarah chose a compromise that reflected both her practical nature and her growing understanding of her own limitations. She would look for suitable shelter locations while continuing to hike, but if she found a good spot or if conditions became genuinely dangerous, she would stop for the night rather than pushing beyond her capabilities. The next hour of hiking tested her decision-making abilities repeatedly. The trail continued across exposed ridges where the wind and rain made progress difficult and potentially dangerous. Several times, Sarah had to stop and wait for lulls in the weather before continuing across particularly exposed sections where a fall could be serious or fatal. But she also encountered terrain that offered potential shelter sites, clusters of large boulders that could provide wind protection, small groves of dense trees, even a few shallow caves formed by rock overhangs. Each location required her to weigh the advantages of immediate shelter against the benefits of continuing toward civilization. Around 8 p.m., as full darkness finally settled over the mountains despite the early hour, Sarah found what appeared to be an ideal shelter site. A large boulder, probably the size of a small house, had split in half millennia ago, creating a narrow but deep cleft that offered protection from wind and rain. The opening faced away from the prevailing storm direction, and the rock walls would provide both wind protection and thermal mass to help retain body heat. Sarah spent 30 minutes exploring the shelter, checking for hazards, and assessing its suitability for overnight use. The floor was dry, covered with years of accumulated pine needles and debris that would provide insulation from the cold rock. The opening was large enough to allow ventilation, but small enough to be warmed by her body heat and a small fire if she could build one. The decision to stop for the night was made for her by her own physical condition. Despite her determination and careful pacing, Sarah was approaching the limits of her endurance. Her hands were becoming numb from cold and wet, making it difficult to handle equipment safely. Her legs were shaking from fatigue, and she had stumbled several times in the last hour, each time coming closer to a potentially serious fall. Setting up her emergency shelter in the rock cleft required every survival skill Jake had taught her, adapted for conditions far more challenging than anything they had practiced. Sarah spread her emergency blanket on the pine needle floor to provide insulation from the ground, then arranged her remaining gear to create the most effective use of the limited space. Building a fire in the confined space required careful planning and execution. Sarah gathered dry materials from deep within the cleft, where years of accumulated debris had been protected from rain. Using techniques Jake had demonstrated, she created a small fire that provided warmth without filling her shelter with smoke or consuming her limited oxygen supply. The night that followed was the longest of Sarah's life. Despite her careful preparations, the cold seeped through her gear and into her bones, making sleep impossible except for brief periods of exhausted unconsciousness. The sound of rain and wind outside her shelter was a constant reminder of how much worse her situation could be. but also of how precarious her current position remained. SAR used the long, dark hours to plan her next day's activities with the same systematic approach she had applied to her professional challenges. She calculated her remaining supplies, estimated distances to potential help, and considered alternative routes if the main trail proved impassable. But she also found herself thinking about things that had never seemed important during her comfortable city life. The warmth of her apartment, the reliability of turning on a faucet and getting clean water, the simple pleasure of a hot meal prepared in a real kitchen. The contrast between her normal life and her current situation was so extreme that it felt almost surreal. As the night wore on, Sarah began to understand something that no amount of research or preparation could have taught her. Wilderness survival wasn't primarily about skills or equipment, though both were important. It was about mental resilience, the ability to keep making good decisions when everything in your environment was trying to break down your judgment and willpower. Dawn, when it finally came, brought mixed news. The rain had stopped, and the wind had diminished to manageable levels. But the temperature had dropped significantly during the night, and Sarah could see fresh snow on the higher peaks around her position. The weather system that had seemed merely challenging the previous evening had developed into something more serious overnight. Sarah's hands were so cold and stiff that it took her nearly an hour to pack her gear and prepare to resume hiking. Every task that should have taken minutes required multiple attempts, and she found herself struggling with equipment that she had handled easily during training exercises. But she was alive, she was functional, and she had survived her first night alone in the wilderness during a significant storm. As Sarah emerged from her rock shelter and looked out at the snow-dusted mountains surrounding her position, she felt a sense of accomplishment, mixed with apprehension about the challenges that still lay ahead. She had no way of knowing that her survival through the night had been observed and recorded by sophisticated surveillance equipment operated by a search team that had been looking for her since shortly after she had first gone missing. The Army Rangers who had been deployed to find her had located her position hours earlier, and they had watched through the night as she demonstrated exactly the kind of resilience and practical problem-solving that their own training was designed to develop. But they had also observed the deteriorating weather conditions and Sarah's growing exhaustion, and they knew that her window of survival was beginning to narrow. The rescue operation that had been carefully planned to test both Sarah's abilities and their own was about to shift into high gear, bringing together military precision, advanced technology, and human courage in a drama that would capture national attention. What Sarah didn't know as she prepared to leave her overnight shelter was that her disappearance had triggered a chain of events that reached far beyond the Colorado mountains. Jake Morrison had not forgotten about her, nor had he abandoned his responsibility as her instructor. The reality of her situation was far more complex than she could have imagined. Jake himself was lying in a hospital bed in Grand Junction, Colorado, fighting for his life after a massive heart attack that had struck him down just hours after dropping Sarah at her assigned location. The stress of leading wilderness expeditions for over 15 years, combined with an undiagnosed genetic heart condition, had finally caught up with him during what should have been a routine training exercise. The helicopter Sarah had seen on her second day had indeed been a medical evacuation aircraft, but not for one of her fellow participants. It had been rushing Jake to the regional medical center after David, the triathlete from Seattle, had found their instructor, collapsed and unconscious at the base camp. His lips blue and his breathing shallow and irregular. The other 7 participants in the survival course had been evacuated immediately once Jake's condition was understood. But in the chaos of the medical emergency, the evacuation checklist that Jake had always insisted upon was forgotten. Sarah's remote location and individual exercise timeline meant that no one except Jake knew exactly where she was or when she was supposed to return. It wasn't until Jake regained consciousness 18 hours later, his first words a panicked inquiry about the accountant on the East Ridge, that anyone realized Sarah was still in the wilderness, alone and unaccounted for. The medical staff had to restrain him physically as he tried to leave his hospital bed, insisting that someone had to reach her before the weather system that was approaching the mountains. The search and rescue operation that followed Jake's revelation was unlike anything Colorado had seen in recent memory. Within 2 hours of learning about Sarah's situation, teams from 3 different agencies were mobilizing resources for what everyone understood would be a race against time and weather. But this rescue operation had an unusual complication that would transform it from a routine search and rescue into something far more significant. Colonel Patricia Hayes, commanding officer of the 75th Ranger Regiment's Mountain Warfare Training Unit, happened to be conducting exercises in the same general area when the call for assistance went out. Colonel Hayes was a legend in special operations circles, a 20-year veteran who had earned her reputation in some of the military's most challenging environments. When she learned that a civilian was trapped alone in the mountains with a major weather system approaching, she saw an opportunity to provide her Rangers with the kind of real-world training exercise that no simulation could duplicate. "This is exactly what we train for," she told her assembled team during the mission briefing. One person, adverse weather conditions, complex terrain, and a time-critical situation where failure is not an option. The only difference is that this time the person we're rescuing isn't a fellow soldier. The Rangers who were deployed to find Sarah represented the pinnacle of military training and expertise. Each member of the 12-person team had completed the Army's most demanding schools and had experience in mountain operations around the world. They carried equipment that civilian search and rescue teams could only dream about: thermal imaging devices, satellite communication systems, advanced GPS units, and specialized cold weather gear designed for operations in the world's most challenging environments. But perhaps more importantly, they brought a level of systematic planning and execution that approached the rescue operation as both a humanitarian mission and a training opportunity. Every aspect of the search was carefully coordinated, with backup plans for the backup plans and contingencies for scenarios that civilian searchers might never consider. The Rangers' first task was to establish Sarah's exact location and current condition. Using topographic analysis and Jake's detailed description of her assigned area, they identified the most likely positions she might occupy and began systematic surveillance of each location using long-range optics and thermal imaging equipment. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, the team's communications specialist, located Sarah's heat signature at the pickup point just as she was preparing to abandon the location ahead of the approaching storm. "We have eyes on the subject," she reported to Colonel Hayes. "Single individual. Appears to be mobile and preparing to move from current position." The Rangers watched from concealed positions as Sarah made her decision to leave the relative safety of the pickup point and begin her solo journey through increasingly dangerous conditions. It was exactly the kind of decision-making moment that their own survival training was designed to address, and they observed her methodical approach to the problem with professional interest. "She's thinking it through," observed Captain James Rodriguez, the team leader. "Good situational awareness, checking weather patterns, preparing gear systematically. She's got good instincts for someone without military training." But the Rangers also understood, better than Sarah possibly could, exactly how dangerous her situation was becoming. The weather system approaching from the west was more severe than local forecasters had predicted, with the potential for heavy snow, high winds, and temperatures that could drop below freezing even at relatively low elevations. As Sarah began her solo hike through the forest, the Rangers initiated a parallel movement that kept her under constant observation while remaining invisible to her. This was exactly the kind of operation they had trained for in mountains around the world, but it was also more complex because their mission was to rescue rather than engage. "We could extract her right now," suggested Sergeant First Class David Kim, the team's medic, as they watched Sarah struggling with the deteriorating weather conditions. "She's showing early signs of exhaustion and possible hypothermia. Why are we waiting?" Colonel Hayes, monitoring the operation from her mobile command post, had made a decision that reflected both military pragmatism and respect for Sarah's determination to save herself. "She's competent, and she's handling the situation. This is valuable training for us, and it's character building for her. We intervene only if she reaches the point where her life is genuinely in danger." The Rangers continued their invisible escort as Sarah made her way across the exposed ridges, noting her decision-making process and her responses to the increasingly challenging conditions. When she chose to stop for the night in the rock cleft, they established a perimeter around her position and maintained watch throughout the storm. "Subject has demonstrated excellent judgment in shelter selection," Captain Rodriguez reported. "Natural wind protection, thermal retention, good visibility for signaling." She's built a sustainable fire and appears to be managing hypothermia risk effectively. But the Rangers were also monitoring weather data that Sarah couldn't access, and they knew that her situation was about to become much more dangerous. The storm system that had brought rain to the lower elevations was developing into a significant snow event at higher elevations, with the potential for several feet of accumulation and whiteout conditions that could make travel impossible. As dawn broke over Sarah's overnight shelter, Colonel Hayes made the decision that would transform the training exercise into something much more dramatic. "Weather window is closing fast," she announced to her team. "We need to be prepared for immediate extraction if conditions deteriorate further. But I want to see how far she can push herself first." The Rangers' overnight surveillance had revealed something that impressed even these elite soldiers. Sarah's systematic approach to survival was remarkably sound, despite her lack of formal training. Her shelter selection, fire management, and gear organization showed a level of practical intelligence that spoke well for her chances of surviving extended exposure if necessary. But they had also observed the physical toll that the experience was taking. Sarah's movements were becoming slower and less coordinated, classic signs of exhaustion and cold exposure. Her decision-making was still sound, but the Rangers could see that she was operating closer to the edge of her capabilities with each passing hour. As Sarah prepared to resume hiking on the morning of her third day in the wilderness, the Rangers were positioning themselves for what Colonel Hayes had designated as the final phase of the operation. If Sarah could demonstrate that she could continue making good decisions under extreme stress, they would allow her to continue. But if she showed signs of impending failure, they would intervene immediately. The test that Sarah didn't know she was taking was about to reach its climax. The weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Her physical reserves were approaching exhaustion, and the margin for error was shrinking with each hour. But she had also demonstrated a level of resilience and practical problem-solving that had impressed professional soldiers who made their living in dangerous situations. What happened next would depend entirely on Sarah's ability to maintain her systematic approach to survival, as conditions pushed her toward the absolute limits of human endurance. The Rangers were ready to save her life if necessary, but they were also prepared to watch her save herself if she proved capable of doing so. The mountains, indifferent to human plans and military precision alike, were about to deliver their final test of both Sarah's determination and the Rangers' expertise. The outcome would depend on split-second decisions, years of training, and the kind of courage that emerges only when everything is on the line. As Sarah stepped out of her shelter into a world transformed by overnight snowfall, she had no idea that her every move was being observed by some of the most capable rescuers on Earth. She was about to face the greatest challenge of her life, with resources and backup that she couldn't imagine, in a drama that would test the limits of human capability and military precision. The final act of her survival story was about to begin. Sarah stepped out of her rock shelter into a world she barely recognized. Overnight, the mountains had been transformed by several inches of heavy, wet snow that clung to every surface and obscured familiar landmarks. The temperature had dropped significantly, and her breath formed white clouds in the thin mountain air. Every step left a clear print in the snow, creating a trail that would be visible for days, but also revealing just how much the conditions had deteriorated. The systematic approach that had served her well over the past 2 days now became even more critical. Sarah forced herself to stand still for several minutes despite the cold, and carefully assess her situation with the same methodical precision she would apply to a complex spreadsheet analysis. Her physical condition was a growing concern. She was exhausted from 2 nights of minimal sleep. Her food supplies were nearly gone, and she could feel her body struggling to maintain core temperature despite her careful attention to clothing layers and heat conservation. Her hands were becoming increasingly numb, making it difficult to handle equipment, and her legs felt unsteady on the snow-covered rocks. The weather conditions presented a new set of challenges that her research and training had only touched upon. The snow made the already difficult trail treacherous, hiding obstacles and creating slippery surfaces where a fall could result in serious injury. Visibility was limited by low-hanging clouds that obscured distant landmarks she had been using for navigation. But perhaps most critically, Sarah recognized that she was approaching a decision point that would determine whether she lived or died. She could attempt to continue hiking toward the main camp, covering perhaps 4 more miles through increasingly dangerous terrain. Or she could focus on survival in place, conserving her energy and resources while hoping that search teams would eventually find her location. The logical part of her mind, the analytical framework that had built her career, told her that staying put was the safer choice. Her current shelter was adequate. She had successfully survived 2 nights already, and any search operation would eventually reach this area if they had proper information about her route. But another part of her, driven by growing desperation and a realistic assessment of her dwindling resources, argued for making one final push towards safety. Every hour she spent in the mountains increased her risk of making a fatal mistake, and the improving weather conditions might not last long enough for her to get another opportunity. Sarah made her decision with the same careful analysis she had applied to every challenge over the past 3 days. She would attempt to reach the main camp, but she would do so with a systematic plan that accounted for her reduced capabilities and the increased dangers of the snow-covered terrain. She would move slowly and methodically, checking each step carefully before committing her weight. She would stop every 30 minutes to assess her condition and the weather patterns. Most importantly, she would turn back immediately if she encountered conditions beyond her ability to handle safely. What Sarah didn't know as she began what she intended to be her final push toward safety was that her every move was being observed by the Rangers, who had maintained surveillance throughout the night and were now positioned at strategic points along her probable route. Colonel Hayes, monitoring the operation from her command post, watched through real-time video feeds as Sarah emerged from her shelter and began her careful assessment of conditions. "She's thinking it through," the colonel observed with professional admiration. "Good situational awareness under extreme stress. That's exactly what we try to teach our own people." The Rangers had spent the night preparing for multiple scenarios depending on Sarah's decisions and the weather conditions. They had identified extraction points along her route, where helicopter rescue would be possible, established supply caches that could sustain Sarah if she needed to shelter in place for extended periods, and positioned team members who could provide immediate assistance if her condition deteriorated to life-threatening levels. But Colonel Hayes had also made a decision that reflected both military discipline and respect for human courage. "She's earned the right to try," she told her team. "We intervene only if she's about to make a fatal mistake or if her condition becomes genuinely critical. Otherwise, we let her save herself." As Sarah began her careful progress through the snow-covered forest, the Rangers initiated a complex operation that kept her under constant protection while remaining invisible. Sergeant First Class Kim, the team medic, shadowed her movements from a distance of less than 50 meters, ready to provide immediate assistance if she fell or showed signs of medical emergency. Captain Rodriguez positioned himself ahead of her route, identifying potential hazards and radioing back information that allowed other team members to be prepared for problems before Sarah encountered them. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez maintained communication links that could bring helicopter support within minutes if extraction became necessary. Sarah's progress was slower than she had hoped, but steadier than the Rangers had expected given her condition and the challenging terrain. She demonstrated the systematic approach that had impressed her military observers, checking each step carefully, using her hiking poles effectively for balance, and stopping regularly to assess her condition and the route ahead. But the Rangers could also see what Sarah couldn't: the physical toll that 3 days of survival conditions was taking on her body. Her movements were becoming less coordinated, and she was making small mistakes that suggested impaired judgment from exhaustion and cold exposure. Most critically, she was beginning to show signs of the tunnel vision that could cause experienced hikers to walk past obvious dangers or miss clear signs of changing weather conditions. 2 hours into her final hike, Sarah encountered the obstacle that would determine the outcome of her survival ordeal. The trail crossed a steep slope that had been transformed by overnight snow into a treacherous traverse, where a single misstep could result in a fall of several hundred feet. Under normal conditions, this section of trail was challenging but manageable for experienced hikers. With snow covering the rocks and obscuring the exact route, it became a technical climbing problem that would test the skills of professional mountaineers. Sarah stood at the edge of the traverse for nearly 15 minutes, using her analytical skills to assess the route and her chances of crossing safely. She could see the trail continuing on the far side of the slope, perhaps 60 feet away, but the route across was partly hidden by snow and would require her to trust her footing on potentially unstable rocks. The Rangers watched her decision-making process with intense professional interest. This was exactly the kind of situation their own training was designed to address, and they knew that Sarah's next decision would determine whether their mission ended in successful rescue or potential tragedy. "She's at her limit," observed Sergeant Kim, watching through high-powered optics as Sarah swayed slightly from fatigue while studying the traverse. "Core temperature is probably borderline, coordination is degraded, and she's been operating on adrenaline reserves for hours." Colonel Hayes faced her own decision point. Sarah was clearly approaching the edge of her capabilities, but she had also demonstrated remarkable resilience and sound judgment throughout her ordeal. The question was whether to intervene before she attempted the dangerous traverse, or to allow her to make the attempt with invisible safety backup. "Position extraction team at the base of the slope," the colonel ordered. "If she falls, we need to be there immediately. But I want to see if she makes the right call here." Sarah's decision, when it came, reflected both her analytical nature and her growing understanding of her own limitations. Instead of attempting the dangerous traverse, she began looking for alternative routes that might allow her to bypass the hazard or find a safer crossing point. Her systematic search led her to a route that was longer but significantly safer, following a ridgeline that added perhaps a mile to her journey, but avoided the exposed traverse entirely. It was exactly the kind of decision-making that survival instructors hoped to teach their students, and it demonstrated that her judgment was still functioning despite her physical deterioration. But the alternative route also brought Sarah into direct contact with the Rangers, who had positioned themselves along the ridgeline to provide security for exactly this contingency. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez was the first person Sarah had seen in 3 days when she emerged from a cluster of snow-covered pine trees and found herself face-to-face with a figure in military winter camouflage, carrying equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. "Ma'am, I'm Staff Sergeant Gonzalez, United States Army Rangers," the soldier said calmly, as if encountering exhausted civilians in remote wilderness locations was a routine part of her day. "We've been looking for you. Are you injured? Do you need immediate medical attention?" Sarah's first reaction was relief so profound that her legs nearly gave out beneath her. For 3 days, she had maintained her composure through systematic planning and sheer willpower, but the sight of another human being, especially one who was clearly equipped and trained for mountain rescue, broke through her emotional reserves. But even in her exhausted state, Sarah's analytical mind was working. "How did you find me? How long have you been looking? Is Jake all right?" The answers she received over the next few minutes as Sergeant Kim provided her with food and warm liquids while assessing her medical condition revealed the full complexity of her situation for the first time. Jake's heart attack, the delayed realization that she was missing, the mobilization of military resources for her rescue. But perhaps most surprising was Colonel Hayes' explanation, delivered personally when she reached Sarah's position 30 minutes later, of why the Rangers had observed her struggle for so long without intervening. "You demonstrated exactly the kind of resilience and problem-solving ability that we try to develop in our own soldiers," the colonel said. "You earned the right to save yourself, and you very nearly succeeded. We were here to make sure you didn't die in the attempt, but the survival skills you showed over the past 3 days were impressive by any standard." Sarah's rescue, when it finally came, involved capabilities that seemed almost magical after her days of primitive survival. Helicopter extraction from a landing zone that the Rangers had prepared in advance, medical evaluation using portable equipment that could perform tests she associated with hospital emergency rooms, and communication systems that had kept her family informed of her condition even while she was unaware that anyone was looking for her. But perhaps more meaningful to Sarah was the recognition from professional soldiers that her systematic approach to survival had been sound, and that her decision-making under extreme stress had met military standards for performance under pressure. The story that emerged over the following weeks, as Sarah recovered from her ordeal and the Rangers debriefed their unusual training exercise, captured national attention as an example of both human resilience and military excellence. Eris Arestio's methodical approach to survival, combined with the Rangers' sophisticated rescue operation, became a case study used in survival schools and military training programs. But for Sarah herself, the most important outcome was the knowledge that she had found capabilities within herself that she had never suspected. The accountant who had signed up for a wilderness course to prove she was capable of more than spreadsheets had discovered reserves of strength and resourcefulness that would influence every decision she made for the rest of her life. Jake Morrison, recovering slowly from his heart attack, would later tell reporters that Sarah's survival was a testament to the effectiveness of proper training combined with individual determination. She took everything we taught her and applied it under conditions far more challenging than anything we had planned, he said. That's what real survival skills are all about. The mountains that had tested Sarah so severely returned to their ancient silence, indifferent to human drama, but having served as the backdrop for a demonstration of both individual courage and collective expertise. Sarah Mitchell had survived not just because of her own efforts, but because she had unknowingly been surrounded by professionals who understood that sometimes the greatest rescue is allowing someone to rescue themselves. Her story would become a reminder that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, and that the most sophisticated military training in the world is sometimes best used not to take over, but to provide invisible support for human courage and determination.